hoping to win back a larger share of the market. CNN technology correspondent Rick Lockridge reports.
In the cutthroat video game industry, one word seems to be all-powerful.
The graphics. Better graphics means it's more realistic.
And embattled Sega's new Dreamcast video game console is graphically better. The first home unit able to handle 128 computer bits of data at once. Twice as much as the Sony PlayStation and Nintendo 64 machines that dominate the $12 billion a year U.S. video game market.
60 frames a second, which is twice the speed of a TV.
It's hard to actually believe that at one point Sega was one of the gaming greats of the gaming world. Sega used to be in the same contention, the same contender, in the same league as Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft many years ago. Looking at the current state of Sega, Sega no longer makes consoles, and Sega is no longer one of the huge video game companies. But even then, Sega has still managed to prosper throughout the decades despite no longer making consoles. Many people always ask, what happened to Sega? What actually happened to one of the legendary contenders who used to be Nintendo's rival? Well, in today's video, guys, I'm going to be talking about what happened to Sega and why Sega pretty much spiraled down into this downfall and became the way it is today with Sega. So, welcome to the day that Sega died. When it comes to Sega, one of the biggest issues Sega has always had, and it's some kind of ironic twist of fate, Sega's biggest problem is now one of their greatest allies, and that was Nintendo and Mario themselves. Back in the 90s, Sega was in complete competition with Super Mario, which effectively created the console wars. It was always Sega versus Nintendo, and later on Sega, Nintendo versus Sony. So effectively, it was Sonic and Mario versus Crash Bandicoot. When it came to games and consoles, Sega tried their best to keep up, but Nintendo was a juggernaut at the time. And coming off Super Mario Bros., Nintendo was known as literally the company that saved gaming, okay? Mario was known as the guy who saved video games. And anybody who had to compete with the juggernaut that was Super Mario was doomed to fail. I mean, there was no fighting against Jumpman, aka Mario, the hero of video games. So not only was Sega tasked with competing with Nintendo, they also were tasked with creating a mascot to rival Mario. And eventually, guys, we landed on Sonic. So right out the gate, Sega already had stiff competition facing and going head to head with Nintendo. Now, I want to say that in hindsight, Sega might have failed when it came to consoles, but honestly, could you blame them? I mean, no other company went head to head with Nintendo at that time. It was literally only Sega for the most part. And back in the 90s, Nintendo was the absolute juggernaut. I mean, the Super Nintendo was probably the best console of all time. So when it comes to someone going against Nintendo back then, there was no competition. So for Sega to even last that long against Nintendo was a feat in itself. So you gotta give Sega some credit, man. I remember back when I was a kid, guys, the console wars were insane, man. In every Game Informer magazine and every commercial, it was always Sonic versus Mario, Sega versus Nintendo. And honestly, Sega just had so much competition with the Super Nintendo in general. So for Sega to go head to head with Mario, they were always stressed. They were always pressed. Right from the gate, Sega was always the underdog, and Sega was always the ones with their back against the wall. And things got much worse when Sony entered the race with the PlayStation 1. So not only did Sega have to go against the N64 and the Super Nintendo, Sega also had to go face to face with the revolutionary PlayStation 1 and Crash Bandicoot. So not only were they facing the juggernaut Nintendo, Sega had to go head to head with the juggernaut Sony. So as far as video game console wars goes, if I was Sega, I would have been absolutely terrified to go against a brand new revolutionary console with the PS1. And then again, Nintendo was not showing any signs of failure. So having to go against both of those companies back in the 90s had to be a daunting feat for Sega. Sega being the underdog in this console war, Sega was always forced with their back against the wall to always try to revolutionize and innovate their gaming consoles and video games. One of the biggest issues that also plagued Sega, aside from the console wars, was the consoles themselves. Sega never really had the budget and creative team to really push through and face fierce competition from Sega and Sony. And with that, guys, Sega was forced to always try to innovate or try to create new consoles that would literally change the landscape of gaming. One of those first consoles was the infamous Sega Saturn, which I don't know too many people who had Sega Saturn, guys, but I figure this is a great time to give you guys my backstory on Sega and Sega Saturn. So this is going to sound cliche, guys, like some of those creepypasta videos, but my first experience with Sega is I was 8 years old, and I already watched Sonic the Hedgehog. I used to watch the Sonic cartoon in the morning. You know, Sonic Says. I used to watch Sonic Satan with Sally Acorn, Sonic Underground. So I was already a major Sonic fan. So my mom decided to get a Sega Genesis from the flea market. Now I know it sounds like some bad creepypasta story, but it was true, guys. My Sega Genesis was at a flea market. So my mom bought the Sega Genesis and it blew my mind. My first game was Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Sonic 3D Blast. And those were my favorite games for the system. Eventually I got Sonic 2 and Sonic 1, but as a little kid, guys, as an 8-year-old kid in the 90s, having a Sega Genesis, it just felt so different from the Super Nintendo. Now, of course, I owned a Super Nintendo as well, but the Sega Genesis was just something special. I mean, Sega just had this. It was such a surreal experience, you know. I mean, I was always a Mario fan. So when I finally got a Sonic game, you know, I no longer saw console wars. I just saw my favorite character Sonic and my favorite character Mario. So I had a Sega Genesis and a Super Nintendo. So it didn't really matter to 8-year-old chaos, but I truly enjoyed my Sega Genesis and I loved it. Fast forward a couple of years, guys. I'm a little bit older, 12, 13, whatever the case is. My stepbrother had a Sega Saturn, which he never played, and it was absolutely amazing. I mean, to me, the Sega Saturn was like, it had discs. Like, guys, Sega Saturn had discs, man. I mean, there were games like Virtual Cop, which is an arcade shooter. There were games like Clockwork Knight. I mean, Sega Saturn was a revolutionary console that I think never got the credit it deserved. And the reason why is because the Sega Saturn was plagued with so many issues and bad creative decisions. So with Sega America and Sega Japan pretty much 1v1 battling each other, Sega was basically doomed to fail at this point. The Sega Saturn was a complete failure due to internal politics and conflicts between Sega America and Sega Japan. Basically what happened was Nintendo cornered the gaming market for the most part, and with Sony on the way, Sega Japan panicked and they did a mass release of the Sega Saturn much too early into the American markets. So the Japanese Sega studio literally contacted the US Sega studio, and they forced the Saturn to release much earlier than it was intended. So the Sega Saturn released before the PlayStation at an unbelievable price. It was like about $400, which was way too much back then. And not only that, the Sega Saturn released with barely any games. So Sega Japan panicked and tried to beat Sony before they released the PlayStation, but instead they released an overpriced, non-working console that was too much money with barely any games on it. And that caused Sega Saturn to literally crash in America. So because of internal conflict between Sega Japan and Sega US, they literally destroyed the Saturn's release. And there was no competition between Sony and Nintendo, man. The Sega Saturn was basically dead on arrival. But that's not just the biggest issue, guys. The biggest issue from this was that Sega never recovered from this fiasco. The The Sega Dreamcast was the last straw on the camel's back, so to speak. The last quill on the hedgehog's back, man. Stemming from all the issues with fierce competition from Nintendo and Sony, and then you had eternal conflict in Sega America versus Sega Japan. There were just so many problems plaguing Sega that they literally could never recover, and it affected the Dreamcast heavily. Despite the Dreamcast being a successful console at the beginning with cool game releases such as Soul Calibur and Power Stone and of course the legendary Sonic Adventure series, you would have think that Dreamcast would have been successful. But the Dreamcast made another critical mistake. Sega America and Sega Japan made another critical error that legitimately killed Sega right where they stood. And that was they released the Sega Dreamcast too soon, right in the wake of the legendary PlayStation 2. Now, when Sega dropped the Dreamcast, the PS2 was right around the corner. And as you guys know, the PlayStation 2 was revolutionary. The PS2 is honestly, guys, my favorite console of all time. The PS2 had a game for everybody. And the PlayStation dropped, the PS2 dropped with games like Final Fantasy X, Metal Gear Solid 2, Devil May Cry. I mean, the early lineup of PS2 games was absolutely stellar. So when it came to games like, you know, you're looking at Sonic Adventure, and then you look at PS2 and it has Final Fantasy X, Metal Gear Solid 2, Devil May Cry. I mean, looking at Sega Saturn and Sonic Adventure and Power Stone and Soul Calibur, why buy that when I could buy the big dog and literally the brand new console in the game? And that was the PS2. So not only was Sega still competing with Nintendo, they also had to contend with Sony at the same time. So when it comes to the day that Sega died, guys, Sega finally collapsed as far as a game console maker, and they quietly retired and just regulated to making video games. So when you look at the overall story, everybody, Sega was always the back against the wall, man. Sega was getting hit from all sides. They were legitimately under fire since the day they came out. Sega was always in direct competition with Nintendo, and then later on they were destroyed by Sony. So the entirety of Sega's whole career, they were fighting a losing battle against two of the legendary juggernauts who are still fighting to this day, guys. Sony and Nintendo are still two of the big three game companies in the world. And honestly, it's sad to say, but in the end, guys, Sega never stood a chance. And I don't care if Sega lost the console war, because Sega still, with the odds against them and their back against the wall, Sega still managed to win gamers' hearts, man. I mean, think about it, guys. If anybody went against Nintendo, they would fail. It literally had to be Sony. Sony was the only one capable of competing with Nintendo. And now we have Microsoft to round out the big three game companies in the world. So, like I said, guys, even though Sega might have lost the race, they won our hearts. And that's literally what it is, guys. Sega still continues to this day, and even though they lost, they're still fighting, man. Still fighting the good fight. Sega never gave up. So, thank y'all for watching. I am Lost Chaos. If you enjoyed this video, you guys can drop a like and subscribe for more news, stories, reviews, and all types of other content I have planned. What was your first Sega game? Let me know in the comments. Let's talk about the game console wars. Whose side were you on? Were you Sony? Were you Nintendo? Were you Sega? Were you Sonic, Mario, or Crash? All you older gamers out there who are my age, let's talk about the 90s. Let's talk about Sega. Let's talk about all those old school games, because that was the era of games I came from, guys. The 90s is my gaming era, so I was a little kid during the console wars, and honestly, it was an amazing time for video games. I mean, just the 90s in general was such an amazing time for video games, so I'm glad to have been old enough to enjoy games at the time. So I had my Sega Saturn, I had Sega Genesis, I had N64, I had PlayStation, I had Super Nintendo. So even though there were console wars, guys, I owned every single console. And to this day, guys, I have a Switch, I have PC, I have Xbox, and I have PlayStation. So even to this day, guys, the console wars never mattered because I still own every console. So that's pretty much my thoughts on that, guys. So let's talk about the 90s. Let's talk about console wars. And let's talk about the day that Sega died. So thank you all for watching. I am Lost Chaos, and peace.